Hey everyone, so let's start this by just hitting B to open the browser. We're going to choose something for this instrument track. So there's a number of built-in synths in Bitwig that you may be tempted to reach for when you want to accomplish something. So for example, we have, let's look at devices, instrument devices. We've got a sampler, we've got Polysynth, Polymer, Polygrid, Phase 4, organ, FM4, and I would make the argument that a lot of these you should never use. This sounds like a very crazy statement, but bear with me and I think I will be able to explain. So I'm going to ignore organ, I'm going to ignore the sampler, but I'm going to focus on Phase 4, FM4, Polymer, and Polysynth here. So let's open Phase 4. This is one of the newer ones. It has a slightly newer UI. But right off the bat, looking at this, there's 4 oscillators. It's a phase distortion synth. There's some interesting controls that are exposed here. There's kind of like what kind of cross modulation you want. But it's kind of pretty like fixed in its architecture and what you can do, and it's hard to understand what the signal flow is. There's like different mix amounts. I don't know. You have to sit here and think a little bit about like what you're even trying to do and what you're seeing here. So let's say, let's look at FM4 instead. And again, we have a number of oscillators that can kind of cross modulate with different harmonics. With this mixer, let's say, how do we use an envelope? Let's see how other people use it. Let's try this patch. So yeah, so for the most part, a lot of the built-in patches, they'll just use envelopes that are built in. So we have this ADSR, we have this HDSR, another ADSR, an LFO, and then there's some effects chains built in. So then let's look at Polysynth. Polysynth, and let's open a random patch for that. Okay, there's a couple oscillators here. There's oscillator width. There's kind of all these different sub-controls in the oscillator. And again, most of it's kind of built off of these modulators and then trying to understand what the signal flow of the filter is and the 2 oscillators. And, there's this blend control. There's this and that. But you kind of have to think about how all of this is set up. And it's just not super easy on the eyes. So you might wonder where I'm going with this. Let's take a look at Polymer as my last example. So if you look at Polymer, this is kind of the newest built-in synth. And what's cool about Polymer is, there's only a single oscillator and there's a sub-oscillator as well, and you can do some cross-modulation here. But it's cool that you can kind of switch out these modules, and it's a little bit of a more sophisticated envelope that you can kind of switch the modes. There's a pluck mode. And again, you know, we can open up a patch, and for the most part, patches are built out of, you know, the built-in Bitwig modulators and the kind of oscillator section. But now the punchline here is that I think for the most part, you can do all of these things in Polygrid, and it's easier to understand, and it's faster to work with, and it's more flexible, especially when you're designing a patch from scratch. So I think a misconception that people have with Polygrid is that it is difficult to understand, it's difficult to use, it's slow to work with. Having all these controls in front of you is a lot better. I used to be one of those people, but there are reasons why I don't believe that's actually true. So just give me a moment here and I can try to explain. But one thing about Polymer is that there is a patch view, and you might bring this up and you might look at it and say, this looks really confusing and complicated. I don't want to have to think about all of these little weird splitter control sync things. And you're right, you shouldn't have to think about those. But the reason all of these are here is because they are exposing controls down here. They are here to make swapping things out and turning on oscillator sync and things like that easier for the GUI. But when you're designing from scratch, you don't need all this stuff. So let me explain. Let me convert this to a polygrid. And now that I can convert it to a polygrid, I'll press D to hide the device view. Middle mouse click kind of scrolls around the view. So one thing right off the bat that I like is you can understand the signal flow just by looking at the arrows in Polygrid. This is a really cool thing. But let's think about what's going on here. So there is some sub-oscillator in this patch. But it's not, the sub-sync is not on. So we don't need this. We can delete that. Because we don't need that, we don't need this little thing that maps to the gate. So and I don't think we need this noise thing. So I think we can just get rid of this, get rid of this. We don't need this cross modulation. Should we just have this really basic sub oscillator blended with the swarm oscillator? And then we're not using noise in this patch, so we don't need these. The filter envelope, this is messy. We don't need this wire. We can actually essentially control that like that. Let's see. And we're not doing any velocity stuff. We can delete that. All right, is this hard to understand? We don't have anything panning. This is not hard to understand. We've got a leveler, we've got a little high pass at the end we're not even really using. I mean, for blending two oscillators, there's nothing else that we have to like think about here. This is super simple. So building something like this from scratch in the polygrid is pretty much easier than doing it in Polymer, and simpler. It's just that Polymer has to like give you all the options for like toggling different cross modulation things on. But if you're just designing a patch, you don't have to think about that stuff. So you can just draw the wire or mix the things together. So here's the other thing. Let's start over. Let's just start with a new polygrid. So we just have a clean slate. So this is what polygrid sort of starts out like. if I wanted to do like FM things, if I wanted to replace FM4, firstly, let's think about the kinds of things you want to do with FM4. We have a few different potential FM oscillators that you want to cross modulate. So we might want to change the levels of each of those. And then we might need like 4 oscillators. But let's say, the patch where we have only really wants 2. So we don't have to look at controls for 4 oscillators. We can just have 2 for the time being. And let's say we don't really need to hear this one because we're just going to use it to modulate this one. But let's change these to phase 1 oscillators. And every oscillator has a phase input. Notice how I'm able to really quickly replace the oscillators here. That's an important feature. So now I can do FM oscillation. I can't really hear it yet. And that's just because I haven't turned up the amount. And I can create another envelope. And here's an important detail about the envelopes. The envelopes in the grid are also better than the envelopes in almost any of the other built-in synths, because the envelope in the grid has these different modes. You can use digital mode, for example, and you can change the curves. This is not available in the ADSR. If you look at the ADSR, you can't change the curve. All you have are these things. Let's give it a few voices here. So we have 5 voices. And then say, we want more flexible filters at the end of our patch. So we can put a filter in here, and we can put any filter we want in here, not just the one that's built into FM4 or phase 4, for example. But okay, so we have this envelope. Let's call this FM amount or something. So we have a new envelope called FM amount. We can change the phase modulation amount here. We can replace this with a vowel filter. We can do whatever crazy stuff we want. Let's put a limiter on the master. I don't want to worry about anything here. I'm going to turn it down a little bit. So let's open this again. So yeah, we have these, but what if we want to marry this with another oscillator? So here's another really cool thing you can do in the grid. You can build your own oscillators. So let's build one. It's really easy, really fast. So we just start with a phaser signal. And on its own, it sounds okay. Let's change this back to a solid key or something. Let's modulate it a little bit. But yeah, let's say we want our own oscillator. So we have this phaser thing, and this is a really useful tool for building oscillators. But let's show off another thing that is really good for the grid, and it's really easy to use. I can just plop an oscilloscope in here, so I can see what my waveform looks like. I don't know why I can't look at this in pitch mode. That's okay. You'll see in a second. So with the phaser module, if I go into data, if I go into, data, I can change this phase signal into a sine signal. So this is a sine lookup module, and this takes the phase input and turns it into a sine. So I have a sine wave now. All right, sorry about that, folks. Got it sorted out. So I can see my oscillator here. And if I use the bend module on the phaser, I can change what that sounds like. I can add other phase modules into it. I can add pinch. I can add wrap. Actually, I don't think I want wrap. I can add reverse. I can add formant. Let's see. I can add mirror. Sync. You get the idea. So you can build your own oscillators in here. And again, I can take this, I can mix it into my FM signal. And I can see the exact flow of what I'm doing, and it's really simple. I also like that I get the modulators below what I'm working on, which is above. So like I can, add my randomization down here. I can randomize the shape of this, for example. Let's do like a smoother thing. And let's put that kind of in the middle. Make it bipolar. I guess we don't really want it bipolar. And then I can do things like I can put a filter on just my oscillator. Like I can put a comb filter right there. Maybe I'll move this over so I can see it better, but just my custom oscillator has a comb filter on it. And I want to do some feedback. The other cool thing about it is I can take, for example, the modulator, and let's say I don't want to use phase 1 as the modulator. I can just use a wavetable and kind of move between the indexes here. And I want to use an LFO to change the numerator here. Oops. So yeah, it's super flexible what I want to do. I don't have to do, your typical 4-voice FM patch. I can do parallel routing with multiple filters per oscillator, per voice. But again, I'm not doing anything complicated. I'm just mixing things together. I'm just layering, basically. But it's easier to look at the flow of what's going on and build this out and work with it than it is to look at one of the other huge panels of controls and wondering which things are active, which things are in the signal. And, you know, people will look at you and be like, whoa, what are you doing? You're so smart. You must really know how to do modular stuff. And it's really not the same skill set as modular at all, because of the fact that there are pre-chords. There are these predefined routes. For example, the gate, I can trigger the oscillator with a gate. I don't have to draw from the input. Like if I wanted to, I could take the note in, and trigger this manually. And I could trigger this manually, and I could draw all these cables. And I could trigger the velocity with different things. But you don't have to. That's the beauty of the grid. And again, it's so easy to replace things. That's so nice. I mean, it's so awesome. And this is a lot easier to look at and understand than like the default that you get out of Polymer, for example. So just even starting a new patch, I never even use Polymer because I would just rather have like the blank slate and build out whatever I want. You know, and let's say I wanted to have a wet dry on this, for example. It's really simple. Let's just go back to the beginning. There's something called blend. And I can just blend between the wet and the dry. Another cool thing you can do, like we were looking at one of the synths that had width on the oscillator. You can do a stereo detune here. All of these signals are actually stereo. So sounds pretty cool. Gosh, what else? I think that's basically it. My whole point of this video is that it's really easy to sort of just build something up that's really kind of simple, but you can kind of do whatever you want. You can marry the FM with the subtractive. You know, I can add a wavetable to this if I want. Just patch it right into the mixer and go to town with the wavetables. Just so powerful what you can do. I mean, you can map this ADSR to the index. It's just so fast to work with, and like so flexible. That's kind of the biggest takeaway, is that it lets you do whatever you want in a way that seems daunting at first, but is actually really easy to deal with. So, yeah, I think that's about it. Okay, so one really important point that I wanted to point out is that there are some effects inside of the grid that are polyphonic, which means every voice that you play in the grid. So, you know, I put this back onto a polyphonic mode. I had it off for a minute there. I put this onto a polyphonic mode. I can take chorus and I can put it on one oscillator on one voice, for example. I can put it here in the chain if I wanted to. think that would matter, but it's just something you can do. It's important to note that that is possible. Another thing that's important to note is that if I put an FX grid in the effects chain of the polygrid, or I think directly after also works, that can also run in a polyphonic mode. So anything that is in effects, I can do a glitch machine, I can do like grid reverb, but I can do this per voice. So I can do, I think if I change this to, yeah, so there's a new instance of this reverb per voice, which is not something you can do with the other synths. So you're already missing that flexibility. You can also just do regular kind of, other effects are not per voice. It's just only grid effects really do it, or certain effects that can actually change into grid. Like I think like one of some of the new ones do that. But this is monophonic. But all of this is part of the same patch. So the effects chain, the modulators, and the oscillators, and the filter, which is just, it's just easier to think about it in terms of like, this is the signal flow block, and I can see the signal flow, and I can see how it all works, compared to just looking at, let's go back to this. I mean, look at this. I see all the controls. I don't see how the signal is routed. I don't understand, like, oh, this is just actually one voice that I'm hearing. This is one oscillator I'm hearing. And I have to think about how all of these are affecting each other. And unless I'm super familiar with this one layout, it's not going to be intuitive to me to come up with the idea and execute it. It's fine if I just want to use it for patches, but that's kind of where I'm going with this. And I mean, likewise, let's go back. Let's just look at Polysynth again. I mean, that sounds nice, but it's just one filter. It's just one with like a very limited envelope selection, and then its own, using the modulators for envelopes as well. And then this whole oscillator section is confusing. Unless I'm intimately familiar with these oscillators, I would way rather use the ones in the grid. I mean, look at all of these different unison controls, width controls. Like I showed you that the width thing, I can do that in the grid really simply and easily. I'm pretty sure I can do all of these things in the grid. I don't entirely know how these blend modes work, but again, this is kind of where you get into the more advanced mathy things in the grid that you can sort of accentuate it to do if you really want it to. So there's so many other modules. There's all these data modules. There are all of these things you can start to experiment with, like wave shaping, logic. So if you want to get complicated, you can. You have that ability, but you don't have to. That's the main thing. You don't have to do that. You can keep it simple. And keeping it simple makes it an easier and more powerful synth than any of the other built-in synths, in my opinion. So my one takeaway is, if you like making sounds, use the grid. Just try using it. It's easier to use, better to work with. Overall, just an amazing built-in product. I never use the other things because I know I can do whatever I want to do here. So give it a shot. Let me know what you think. and have fun.